want to tell you guys a really unbelievable story, right? And the title in and of itself is a little bit nutty, all right? The Hasidic Zionist Rebbe who became an atheist and then a Rebbe again. And I'm aware at how many contradictions there are just in that title. And that's the point. And we're gonna get to what exactly happened and why and how all these things transpired. But I want to kind of just frame the story for a second, in terms of at least myself or us as a group. I think one of the things that you'll see in the story is something that we've all dealt with or struggled with or experienced in our lives, which is this idea of our faith being shaken by tragedy, right? How can we see God in the ugliness of our world? And unfortunately, we're still seeing ugliness in our world to this day. It's tragic to think that oftentimes our crisis in faith often comes where perhaps we would need our faith the most. Now, it's nice to say that we have our faith to rely on, and sometimes we do. But other times, to be honest, bad things happen, and it's hard for us to believe. It's hard for us to see the good and see necessarily God's hand in everything. It's difficult. But what I hope this story will show you is that not only is, at least according to Judaism, doubt and a shaken faith very human, but even some, if not all, although they may not always admit it, of the greatest spiritual leaders of Judaism have all had their faith shaken and their doubts at one time or another, or always had their doubts about belief in God and their path and the good in this world. And I think it's important to know these two things, which is, one, it's okay, right? It's not just us. Everybody, every Jew, no matter great Hasidic Rebbe or just everyday Jew, menial Jew, have their times of shaken faith. And it's also never too late to change and get back to our faith when we need to. There's a pretty famous saying from the Hasidic Rebbe, which is interesting enough. We're talking about Hassidut today a little bit. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who says, if you believe breaking is possible, then believe fixing is possible, right? And I think that is going to be a really guiding sentence for us as we tell this story. So I want to share with you the story of perhaps one of the most improbable Jewish journeys of all time. Before we do that, I want to give a little bit of context to what a Rebbe is and what Hassidut is, okay? Jews in Poland in the 17th century were at an all-time low. They had been both physically and spiritually decimated. They had been physically decimated by a 10-year Cossack uprising led by a man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky, which ravaged Poland, and the Jews got the brunt of it. Over 100,000 Jews were murdered in these pogroms. And in addition to the physical terror that the Jews were suffering in Poland at the time, they had also suffered a huge spiritual blow as well. And that was in the man on the left in this slide, which is the Shabtai Tzvi, who was a false messiah, right? Many Jews believed that he was going to usher in the Messianic times. After being imprisoned by the Ottoman king, he was given an option to convert to Islam, perform a miracle on the spot, or be killed. And he was obviously unable to perform a miracle and did not want to die. And so the person who many people in Poland believe was going to be the Jewish Messiah converted to Islam. So that absolutely crushed them, obviously. Now, after such horrible times with the physical pogrom, Jews were looking for the Messiah, and now this Messiah had been turned out to be false. And in addition to that, many of them actually sold off, gotten rid of all their possessions, believing that Shabtai Tzvi was going to bring them all to Jerusalem, in the time of Messiah. And so this also financially ruined the Jews. So out of this horrible situation for the Jews in Poland, a new movement arrived known as Hassidut. Right? Hassidut was basically founded by a rabbi known as the Baal Shem Tov, and it was a new aesthetic way for the uneducated masses to connect to Judaism. Now, I should say Hassidut today and Hassidut then was a little bit different, but basically the idea was that there was going to be these Rebbes. Now, the Baal Shem Tov himself was the first Rebbe, and then his students basically became like the next generation of Rebbes who moved throughout Europe and started their own different sects in the towns in which they lived in. What exactly is a Rebbe? Now, I should say the Rebbe is not a rabbi, right? The Rebbe he may do the things that a rabbi does, right? A rabbi gives a sermon, maybe visits you when you're sick in the hospital, runs a wedding, makes a Jewish law decision. But a Rebbe is more than that. If you want to open a business, you go to the Rebbe for a blessing, right? If you want to get married, you go to the Rebbe and tell him about your prospective husband or wife, and you ask for his blessing. Whatever the Rebbe tells you to do, you follow him, because the idea is that the Rebbe is actually your interceder with God, right? He's on a higher spiritual plane, and he becomes your go-between between you and God. And one of the most important aspects of Hassidut, with the relationship between followers known as Hasidim and the Rebbe, is the Friday night Tish, right? Friday night and holidays. And that's on when all of the followers will come to the Rebbe's house, or if you see on the picture in the top left, sometimes the Rebbe's house isn't big enough, so you have to get these giant stadiums where the Rebbe will sit at the head of a table and everyone will gather around. There'll be lots of singing, lots of dancing, probably a lot of alcohol. The Rebbe will give some words of Torah, and then some food will come out. The Rebbe will eat a little bit of it, and then everyone will fight for the scraps because it's been blessed by the Rebbe. I mention that only because it's gonna factor into the story in a few minutes. But anyway, so the Tish is a big part of this whole ethos of the Hasidic following. But basically, each Rebbe is going to develop their own customs in their own towns, and that's going to be the different sects of Hasidut that we know today, right? Maybe the most famous is Lubavitch or Chabad, right? In the bottom left, they are Hasidic. They are a Hasidic sect, but there are many. There's Belz, there's Karlin Stalin. There's even a Rebbe in Boston. He's known as the Bostoner Rav, and there's the Bostoner Hasidim. So they're really all over the world, and that's the idea here. So the story that I'm going to tell you today is about one such Rebbe. And now that you understand that, it's even more, I think, astounding what his story is. The Rebbe's name is Rebbe Yecheskel Taub. Okay, he was born on October 7th in 1895 into a Hasidic dynasty. His father had moved to a small town outside Warsaw called Yablona. Okay, and so his father was known as the Yabloner Rebbe, right? But I should say he's part of a much larger dynasty. He was the great-great-grandson of the Rebbe from Kuzmir, and Kuzmir is a famous Hasidic town, spawning many other Hasidic sects, including Mozhitz, and they're famous musical Hasidim. You guys may know their song. If you've ever been to a summer camp or any kind of event like that, you may have heard that Havdalah. That is actually the famous tune from Mozhitz, from one of the Hasidic sects. And this is all part of Rabbi Yecheskel Taub's lineage. Okay, and so as I said, he's born in Yablona in 1895, and generally what happens is that the Rebbe's son almost always, or his oldest son, almost always becomes the next Rebbe in line, but it's not always the case. And in this case, actually, Yecheskel Taub was not supposed to become the next Yabloner Rebbe. You're going to see this a lot in his story, that fate conspires to do a lot of very strange things. Rebbe Yecheskel actually was not meant to be the next Yabloner Rebbe because his brother-in-law, his older sister's husband, was so well respected that his father actually thought that he should be the next Rebbe and was actually being groomed for the position. However, his brother-in-law abruptly died at a young age, and that kind of left a vacuum that they assumed Rebbe Yecheskel was going to fill. But look, Rebbe Yecheskel was young and he thought he had time to get prepared. But shortly after his brother-in-law died, his father got very, very sick. And his father in 1920 is going to die at the age of 60. And so at the tender age of 25, not really prepared to be the Yablonner Rebbe because he never expected to be in the first place. Rabbi Cheskel Taub becomes the next Yablonner Rebbe. And he wasn't really prepared, and he credited a lot of his early success to his wife, Pearl, who was able to help him. She came from her own Hasidic dynasty, obviously, and had experience and actually helped him navigate the waters. And he slowly became very beloved by his followers, and was considered to be very warm and personable, in addition to being very learned and intelligent. And he became a rising star in the Hasidic world. Okay? That's what I would call part one, right? Rabbi Cheskel Taub becoming the Yablonner Rebbe. Part two is the next time that we see something that almost never happens. Something improbable happens to the Yablonner Hasidim and the Rebbe in 1924. They were visited by a very charismatic rabbi. His name, you see him here on the left, is Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira. Now, again, Rabbi Shapira himself came from his own Hasidic lineage, but he was also known for something else. He was known in a completely rare circumstance as a Hasidic rabbi who was immensely Zionist. He was very involved in the proto-Zionist movement known as Chovevei Tzion, which actively advocated for the settlement of Jews in Palestine. He actually moved to Palestine in 1914 under the Ottomans, and got to know some of the Zionist pioneers that were there, and became very involved in the Zionist movement, which was rare at the time because the Zionist movement was dominated by secular Jews, many of them openly hostile to religious observance, but that didn't deter Rav Shapira at all. However, when World War I broke out, the Turks expelled many people from Palestine, and that included Rabbi Yeshaya, and he was kicked out of Palestine, and he decided that he was going to create an organization to travel, and he would be the head of it, and he would travel throughout Europe to encourage religious Jews to move to Palestine. Now, he actually, he founds this organization known as Apollo Mizrahi, still exists today. It's an organization that originally was devoted to setting up agricultural settlements in Palestine for religious Zionists. And his ultimate dream was if he could get an entire Hasidic sect to move from Poland to Palestine with their Rebbe and use that as an example for other people to follow, right? Like, look, we could uproot your entire Hasidic sect, bring them to Palestine, you'd be living in the Holy Land, and you wouldn't stop being more religious at all, and you'd be working the land, and it'd be this amazing thing. And so he begins to travel throughout Europe, trying to convince any Hasidic sect that he can to take on this endeavor. And look, Zionism was not, and is not popular amongst the Hasidic community by and large. And I think that may be even an understatement. But in this case, Rav Shapira was determined to find just one. All he needed was one. And so he starts to travel throughout Europe. And one Shabbat, he arrives in Yablona, right? And he spends the Shabbat there with Rabbi Cheskel and his followers. And he gives them the whole spiel, and he tells them all about the Holy Land. And he compares the Balfour Declaration, which had just happened, which was the British support for a Jewish homeland. He compares that to the Decree of Cyrus, right, which was the decree by Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire, allowing the Jews to return and rebuild the Second Temple. And basically, by the time that Shabbat is over, Rabbi Cheskel and the Yablona Hasidim are convinced they are moving to Palestine, which again is insane in and of itself. This would make this story fascinating if this was the only detail. It's crazy. So the whole community decides that they are going to move to Palestine. Eventually, they have to sit down and talk practical, and it is decided that the poorer people will go now and set up the groundwork, while the richer people will stay in Poland and fund the expedition. And once everything is set up, the wealthier people will come and join the poorer people, and they will all live in their new settlement in Palestine. I should say, of course, that Rabbi Cheskel gets very significant backlash from other Hasidic Rebbes, obviously, most notably the Rabbi of Ger, the Ger Rebbe, but this actually is only going to strengthen his resolve. And so within months, him and about 90 of his followers are on a boat on their way to Haifa with cash for hundreds more who want to take part in this crazy, holy, risky endeavor. On the boat with him, he actually meets another Hasidic Rebbe, and they decide to kind of like, not join forces, but kind of like work alongside each other and set up an area of Palestine that would work for them agriculturally and religiously. They arrive in Palestine, and originally he was offered some land near Tel Aviv, but the Yablonner Rebbe decides that he'd rather live on the mountains overlooking the Jezreel Valley near Haifa, and asks the JNF to help him purchase land in the area. And with help, they're able to purchase several thousand acres for this endeavor. Now, the Rebbe reached a financial agreement with the JNF. Basically, and this is going to be important, the agreement was that the payment for the land was going to be a loan that would be repaid to the 90 families after 2 years once the settlement was up and running. And both the JNF and the Rebbe were confident that things were going to work out. This made waves throughout the Zionist world. High-profile visitors flocked to this new settlement to see this unbelievable phenomenon of Hasidic Zionist farmers. Crazy. On the left, you can see that he was visited, that's Rabbi Cheskel Taub here on the left, visited by the great Rav Avram Yitzchak Kook, right? Rav Kook, who was the chief rabbi of Jaffa, or chief rabbi of Jaffa, and then eventually chief rabbi of Palestine, Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Palestine. In the picture on the top right, you can see that he was visited by the father of cultural Zionism, Achad Ha'am, and what we now call today Israel's national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik, two pretty amazing people who had to come and see this for themselves. And even Chaim Weizmann, who would eventually become Israel's first president, had to visit as well. Now, Weizmann, who was pretty powerful in the Jewish Agency, had been particularly critical of Polish immigrants who came to Palestine and refused to work the land, right? Many of them set up urban enclaves in areas such as Bnei Brak and places like that. And when Weizmann heard that there was a Orthodox Polish Jews moving to Palestine, and not only are they moving to Palestine, but they're willing to work the land, like, he had to see this. And his visit became so popular that, if you can see, this is actually in the top middle here, is actually a pamphlet from the JNF, or the KKL at the time, a Keren Kayemet Israel, advertising them. They basically became like this huge advertising model for, look, we have Orthodox Jews who are coming to the land of Palestine as well, right? It kind of became like this recruiting tool for the JNF. And so originally things got off on a good foot, but unfortunately they will not remain that way. Tragically, what happens is that whatever could go wrong went wrong. The former Arab tenants, farmers, right? A lot of times what happened was there were very rich landowners, but there were Arab tenant farmers that were physically living on the land and working it. And when the Jews came and bought up the land, it would displace the Arab workers, and that would make them very angry, and that would generally result in violence between the new Jewish settlers and the Arab tenant farmers. And in this case, the Arab tenant farmers originally actually refused to leave the land and the villages, despite the fact that they had received compensation for it. And that was one really big problem. Another really big problem was that there was a really heavy rain that first year, and the river nearby overflowed, and the entire valley was flooded, and the valley became basically a swamp that made it impossible to farm. Of course, that land also ended up becoming a swamp, meant that it became infested with mosquitoes, which meant that malaria broke out, and many of the Hasidim died. They had built a bridge over the river at one point that was destroyed by local Bedouins. An Arab tenant farmer had actually killed one of the workers' cows and threw it into their well, contaminating all their fresh water. There were venomous snakes hidden among the thorns that would bite the farm workers and killed more than one of them. And Bedouin marauders even murdered some of the newcomers. And so things really started to go downhill. Money started to run out. The dairy farm, which is what they had set up there, really started to stall. And very soon, the Hasidim were literally starving. The Rebbe, by 1928, decides he has to go to America and try and raise money. He goes to America. He's welcomed everywhere he goes. But unfortunately, despite being welcomed warmly, he doesn't really get any money. And things are looking pretty dire. And so ultimately, he has to turn to the Zionist administration, including the Jewish Agency and the JNF, and make a deal. And the deal that he makes is that, first of all the old and the sick who can't really farm, they got to go back to Poland for now. They're a drain on the resources. In addition to that, the land will be handed over to the JNF. The JNF will now own it, and the JNF will take care of the accumulated debt. And the people that are living there will get a stipend. The other thing is that they also were told that the two Hasidic branches of the settlement, remember the other rabbi that he had met on the boat, are now going to have to form and combine to become one single entity, which became known, don't have it here, known as Kfar Hasidim, right? The village of the Hasidim, right? The village of the followers, which is still actually a place in Israel today. So the Yablon Rebbe, Rabbi Cheskel Taub, reluctantly agrees to all of these conditions. And soon the tides seem to turn for the better. But then history continues to intercede. The Rebbe finds himself in the midst of a financial scandal. Basically what happens is the situation in Poland is getting worse, right? Now we're talking about 1935. Hitler is in power and laws are becoming stricter and things are getting worse for the Jews, and more Jews are trying to leave Poland and come live. And the Hasidim of Yablona are like, great, we have this place that we invested in. Remember, the wealthy Jews were like, we invested in this place a bunch of years ago. Now we can run there now that we need a place to run. And so they travel from Poland to Palestine and they show up and they go, okay, great, where's our plot of land? We gave you money a long time ago. And the Yablon Rebbe is like, see about that. We had some really hard times, and we don't own the land anymore. We kind of handed it over. I don't really have land to give you. And these people became furious and start accusing the Rebbe of being a thief. And he begs them to understand, but in their eyes, the Rebbe is a crook. He had fraudulently taken their money and not given what he promised in return. And in addition to that, in 1936, just a year later, violence is going to erupt in Palestine with the Arab revolt against Jews. And there's going to be many Jews living in Kfar Hasidim who want to go back to Poland. And so they go to the Rebbe and say, Rebbe, give us money to go back to Poland. It's not working out here. And again, he has to say, look, I'm sorry, I don't have any money. Like, we handed everything over to the administration, to the Jewish Agency and to the JNF. I don't have any money to give you. And so the people are furious with him, right? And he decides that he's got to do everything he can to not be seen as a crook. And so he decides in 1938 he is going to travel to America to see if he can raise some money to help the situation. And he won't return to Palestine for 40 years. So this is brings us to what I would call part 3. When Rabbi Cheskel Taub arrives in America, he immediately begins fundraising. He begins working on trying to identify the communities who may give him some money. And he even partners with an organization known as the Federation of Polish Jews in America. And it seems like he starts to make headway. But again, history is going to intercede, because it then becomes September of 1939, in which the Nazis invade Poland and World War II begins. Now, Rabbi Cheskel is now stuck in America as a war refugee. And it's actually pretty amazing. I think this tells you a lot about who he was. He decides to try and do what he can for the war effort. This is amazing, he first tries to enlist in the American Army. And for some odd reason, The U.S. Army did not want a mid-40s Polish Hasidic Jew. I can't tell you why. I can't figure it out, but they didn't want him. Okay, they passed on him. And so he decides he's going to go into the military supplies industry and get a job in construction. So he moves out west. He moves to California and becomes a riveter in a shipyard. Yeah? And, eventually becomes the model for Rosie the Riveter. No, I'm just kidding. He doesn't become Rosie the Riveter. But he very much decides he has to do everything he can for the war effort. A Jewish newspaper in 1942 even explained it that, quote, the Rebbe solves the problem of observing the Sabbath without losing hours by working overtime on weekdays. So he was all in on this. Unfortunately, as the war goes on, Jews in America begin to get more and more information about what's going on with Jews in occupied Nazi territory. The Holocaust becomes more and more concrete. And as the Rebbe learns more and more details, he becomes more and more distraught. In addition to his entire community in Poland, Jablona, being completely wiped out by the Nazis, he also feels incredibly guilty for the people that were in Kfar Hasidim that he had to send back. Remember, the old and the sick had to be sent back. He basically sent them back to Europe. And in his mind, he started to believe that the deaths of those people were his fault. And he assumed that all of the Jews back in Palestine felt the same way. In addition to his own personal guilt, he is actually going to become angrier and angrier at God himself until he decides one day, look, I've got no Hasidim. My village is probably in shambles. My faith in God is pretty darn weak. And so just like that, one day, the Rebbe, Yechezkel Taub, the revered Yablon Rebbe, scion of the Kuzmir Hasidic dynasty, and one-time leader of thousands of devoted followers and trailblazing Orthodox Zionist settler, removes his yarmulke, cuts off his peyot, shaves off his beard, quietly changes his name to George Ezekiel Taub Nagel, and puts in papers to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. He avoids all contact with the Jewish community. He was in Los Angeles at this time. He stops keeping kosher. He stops observing Shabbat and festivals, including Yom Kippur. He doesn't study any Torah and almost never visits a synagogue. World War II ends, and the shipyards no longer need George Nagel, as he went by at this point. Right, this is a picture of him on the right here. But the many years working in construction and engineering would not go to waste because Southern California was in the midst of a massive construction boom. And George Nagel immediately seizes on the opportunity. He borrows money to buy a plot of land on which he constructs modest homes. Remember, he's had some experience even before the war with developing towns, right? He's been doing this even back in Palestine. And his knowledge of construction and hands-on work is going to make him a very, very wealthy man with an ever-expanding empire of projects. So now he has gone from being a Hasidic Rebbe to a wealthy real estate mogul in Los Angeles. Occasionally, he would partner on projects with a few Orthodox Jewish Holocaust survivors who had ended up in Los Angeles. Very few of the survivors really knew who he was, and even the ones who did, at his request, kept his identity a closely guarded secret. He is eventually going to befriend one man. His name is Yidel Rotenberg. And Yidel is going to bother him all the time to come back to synagogue. Just come to the synagogue, come to the synagogue. There was a synagogue in the Rabbi Ginsburg Synagogue in Fairfax in Los Angeles. It's a picture of it on the top right here, also still exists today. And every once in a while, George would relent and come to the synagogue, but only on condition that no one be told who he was. And there's just one story from this time period that blows my mind. At one point, a very famous Hasidic Rebbe, the Sadger Prismil Rebbe, visited Los Angeles in the 1950s to visit the Los Angeles Hasidim. Now, the truth is, guys, Los Angeles didn't really have Hasidim, no real Hasidim, as it were. It had a bunch of, like a handful of Holocaust survivors who had been brought up Hasidic, probably didn't observe Hassidut, or probably not even Orthodox Judaism at that point, but they were nostalgic for a taste of their youth. So this Rebbe, the Sadger Rebbe, comes to Los Angeles and decides on Friday night he's going to have a tish, right? Friday night, come, sing, dance, drink, and I'll give you some Torah, and it'll be like old times. And Yidel manages to pester George Nagel into coming to this tish. And so he's sitting there with Yidel, and they're sitting at one of the tables, and just across from him at the very same table, this guy, look, they said the Sediger Rebbe, he was kind of like going through the motions, but Hasidic Judaism had been devastated by the Holocaust, and Los Angeles wasn't the place to really revive it. And so these guys are like, yeah, this isn't really a tish. And this guy sitting at the table with George says, man, you call this a tish? This is a joke, right? This is a shadow of what a real tish should look like. I remember my father once took me to the tish of the Yabliner Rebbe. Now that was a real tish. Real singing, amazing spiritual atmosphere, uplifting for everyone. And the guy gets up and leaves. And he had no idea that he was sitting across the table from the very Yabliner Rebbe who had inspired him so many years before. George didn't say a word. And things go on like this for quite some time. However, in the late 60s, the California economy falls apart, and George Nagel loses almost everything. He then becomes sick and is hospitalized, and his perspective starts to shift just a bit. He begins to be visited by his great nephew. His great nephew's name was Ehud, and Ehud used to visit him and try to pressure him to come back to Israel. And George would say, yeah, I'll think about it, but he was still way too ashamed to ever go back. And he's getting pretty old at this point, right? And now he's in his late 70s, and he's decided it's time for another life change, which is amazing. He decides he wants to go back to school. And so in the late 70s, the former Yabliner Rebbe and Los Angeles real estate mogul enrolls in Cal State University Northridge, also known as CSUN, and moves into the college dorms. You should see the article I have here up on the thing. It's an article from the local paper. The local media ate this up. Right? The 70-year-old guy is hanging out with the college dorm kids, and it was just this cute and hilarious story. But just like everything else he does, he's incredibly determined. And so in 1975, George Nagel graduates from CSUN with a bachelor's degree in psychology. He even, sorry, I'll get to a second. At this point, Ehud is like, look, he's done everything he's want to do. I think now I can get him back to Israel. But he's still not ready. He decides he's going to go volunteer at a drug rehab center. He even writes a book. Right, you can see it there. It's the third one. It's called Paradise Cove. They escaped the cuckoo's nest. It's about his time in the drug rehab center. But what's interesting to think about is that as a worker in the drug rehab center, he is slowly starting to fall into old habits. He is becoming somebody who counsels people. It was his job to counsel the people before they were about to leave rehab. And he's slowly starting to inch back towards his own ways, in some ways, as a Rebbe. Finally, in 1978, George casually mentions to his great nephew that he has booked a round trip ticket to Israel, but he shouldn't tell anyone. Now, of course, Ehud is secretly going to tell the entire family. George flies to Israel. He has a car waiting for him. He drives an hour and a half, basically in silence, from the airport to Kfar Hasidim. He gets out of the car, and he is immediately greeted by his niece, who he hasn't seen in 40 years. She greets him, and she says, "Uncle, I have a surprise for you." He has no idea what's going to happen. He comes back. He follows her, and she takes him to the social hall of the kibbutz, where hundreds of people from the town, from his past, are waiting for him. One by one, family after family gets up and speaks and says, "Rebbe, don't feel ashamed or nervous that you came back. Everyone in this room is alive because you helped us move to Israel and helped us escape the Nazis and helped us become a success. We know how much you wanted to save the others. And all we ever wanted was our Rebbe to come back." George is in complete shock. Family after family after family. And finally he gets up. He has tears in his eyes. He's shaky. And he says, "I never considered what I had saved, only what I had lost. It's time. I'm ready to come home. I'm coming home." He decides he's going to move. He's going to go back to LA to tie up some loose ends, but something still isn't right. It takes him a couple of times back and forth until finally, in 1981, at the age of 86, the Rebbe returns to Kfar Hasidim. and becomes a Rebbe again. He changes his name back to Yechezkel Taub. He regrows his beard, his peyot, and once again becomes the honored Yalbuner Rebbe. And he is the head of this Hasidic sect for 4 more years until he dies at the age of 90. Now, this is an amazing, crazy roller coaster of a story. And there are a lot of ways you can feel about it and a lot of different takeaways. And I just wanted to share my 2 big takeaways from this story and why I chose to tell this story today. The first one I mentioned in the beginning, faith wavers. And that's okay. It's actually a very Jewish thing to do. In fact, in the words of Elie Wiesel, right? I have not lost faith in God. I have moments of anger and protest. Sometimes I've been closer to him for that reason. In fact, that means that your struggle with faith can actually bring you eventually to stronger faith. But again, I think it's really important for us to understand that faith is not a zero-sum game, right? In fact, I would say that the Yalbuner Rebbe was only able to come back to his faith precisely because he was so willing to challenge it. And that's a model I think we all must follow, because otherwise it's blind faith that may not be worth much at all. But the fact that he struggled so mightily and then returned says to him just how much that faith really meant now that it had gone through those trials and tribulations. And that's very Jewish. I mean, Abraham, the first Jew, went through the same things, and every single one of us since then has. And faith doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And I think that's a really important message for some of us, especially in dark times, who struggle with it a lot. And the second thing, and I think this is one that I try and drill into my students as much as possible, is I think we often feel stuck in our ways. And even if we aren't happy with our situation, we often feel resigned to it. And a lot of that can sometimes stem from this feeling that we need to be perfect. And I think that's true in Judaism as well. I think a lot of people look at Judaism and they're like, I can never be a perfect Jew, so like forget it. Like, what am I going to, come on. I can never be a perfect Jew. I think that this story, like many other stories in Judaism, actually is telling us something different. It's telling us that Judaism never asks us to be perfect. If you think about it, we're called Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, which is really Jacob. And Jacob is the most imperfect of all the patriarchs. He's got a lot of, let's say, gray area in his story. We have people like Moses who, is not the Greek god of a figure as our icon. We have David, who is a morally compromised character, as our great king and the father of our messianic dynasty. And these are imperfect people. And I think that the reason why these imperfect people are role models is because we have to understand that perfection is not the goal. Because perfection, if you strive for perfection, we're setting ourselves up for failure. But if Judaism doesn't ask us to be perfect, then the question becomes, what does it ask us to do? And I think the story of Jacob, I think the story of David, and I think the story of the Yalbuner Rebbe tells us a very clear, simple, but important answer. If Judaism asks us to be better than we were the day before. The story of the Yalbuner Rebbe is a roller coaster of self-discovery. But what's clear is that as Rebbe Yechezkel Taub or George Nagel, the Yalbuner Rebbe was simply trying to improve himself each and every day in radical ways. When he became a Hasidic Rebbe unexpectedly, when he became a Zionist, when he became a wartime factory worker, when he became a real estate developer, when he lost it all, when he became a geriatric college student, when he became a drug rehab volunteer, and then when he became a Rebbe again. I mean, when you look at the list, you say, give up, man. At some point, just give up. Forget it. You're not going to do it. But he had this drive, the next thing. He was trying to find the way in which he could give more to himself and to the world. And this striving for a better version of yourself, not your Hasidic lineage, not your amount of Torah knowledge, which, by the way, could be important things. But that is what I think makes the Yalbuner Rebbe a great Jewish role model to me, and hopefully to others, is the striving to be a better version of yourself in all and every endeavor that you take on.